relatively liberal political order, at least relative to what they came out of. Athens, it went from a more tribal, tyrannical structure to a democracy after the reforms of Solon, Cleisthenes, and Ephialtes. Florence became a Republican city-state preceding the Renaissance. The Dutch fought for their independence against Spain and became independent city-states. England was a monarchy, but the parliament had power. There was a budding common law, low taxes, lower than anywhere else in Europe, and tight fiscal policy and relative peace, thanks to Elizabeth. France, by the time of these artists, was also a republic, for the third time. Then we look at economics. They were moving in a laissez-faire direction. Athens had been agrarian. They were becoming stronger traders. Florence was traders. Dutch city-states were traders. Dutch, actually, they had free trade of humans, not in the context of slavery, but over 50% of the population of Amsterdam at this time were first-generation immigrants. England had set up its first stock exchange. It was increasingly trading over the globe, as was France. The interesting thing is you compare some of these with their, like Florence in particular, you compare that with Naples and Milan, who had the wealth and had a significant amount of trade, but they didn't have the same type of order that seems to be necessary to encourage culture. Another thing is that religion was not too terribly heavy in these locations. You look at Netherlands, they were sick of the Protestant Reformation and all the fighting that Germany had experienced. And there were a lot of Jews who moved up there because they could live safely. Florence, again, they had the period where Savonarola moved in, and he didn't like the way Madonna and the saints were being portrayed, but when they got rid of him, boom, arts flourished again. So that seems to be a certain element of importance, and of course, wealth that was created through the trade and the innovation, and for both the consumer and the artist. I mean, these were times of increasing participation, not only by the quantity of artists, but by the quantity of people who were consuming art. I want to talk about music, because this probably is more something that you deal with every day, or that you enjoy every day, especially to highlight Beethoven, who is awesome. But he always seems so intense to me, kind of freaks me out looking over my shoulder. So I'm going to put up a picture of Schroeder from the Peanuts, who loved Beethoven, so it's kind of similar. Quote from him: "I am not out to be a musical usurer, as you think, who writes only to become rich, by no means. Yet I love an independent life, and this I cannot have without a small income." He had more than a small income, don't worry. But the key here is he wanted an independent life. He wanted to make the kind of music that he felt was important, and not necessarily strictly meeting the demands. Now, of course, he did in some ways meet the demand. He made his money from three ways: concerts, grants, and sheet music. If it wasn't for the printing press, the literature market, as well as the music market, would not have advanced. And that's something that people tend to not recognize, is that how heavily music was dependent on the market for sheet music at that time. His wealth allowed him to dabble in all sorts of radical ideas. He was very much a lover of liberty, and Fidelio, just to pick one, is basically a complaint against unjust government imprisonment. I wish they'd play that down in Guantanamo sometime. Beethoven was creating music for the masses, not high art. It wasn't until much later that this becomes high art. I mean, this is like, bubblegum music of its day. People enjoyed this. And later innovators, of course, had to do something different to get people's attention, to get people to enjoy them. Chuck Berry, there's so much. I could talk about Chuck Berry for hours, but I really only have like 2 minutes. He didn't quite roll over Beethoven, as he claimed in one of his songs, but he did a great job, an amazing job, of educating a new consumer base and a new market for a new product out there for rock and roll. Now this came about, rock and roll, due to the ability to record music and to transmit it via radio. If it wasn't for these innovations, if it wasn't for electricity to make this possible, we wouldn't have this. And this created a huge shift in music truly makes the music. And you can't capture that on sheet music. You need to hear an actual recording. Independent labels were possible now since it was cheap to record music and to sell it and transmit it. But it was still difficult because places like ASCAP did not want competition. They sued BMI, small music publisher, for antitrust violations, even though ASCAP controlled 85% of music on TV and 70% on the radio. Again, it's the same type of thing we always hear from certain big corporations that will complain, oh, it's so hard out there, these newcomers coming in and taking our money, and eventually they won out because the stodgy old businesses, they went down in their market share. Some attribute Chuck Berry's song "Too Much Monkey Business" as one of the early precursors to rap, which of course brings us back to P. Diddy and full circle to Christopher Marlowe. Now we're going to talk about the cultural pessimist. Of course, rap brings us to that because how many people do we hear say cultural pessimists, that rap is going to be the end of society? So the first thing we'd like to talk about is a reverence for the past. But not just a reverence for the past, it's that there's nothing as good today nor in the future that will compare to what was in the past. Like we mentioned before, popular culture back then is high art now. In our modern era, we've seen this with jazz, where in the 20s it was sinful music of the devil. By the 60s, it's considered an advanced art form. Now, because of modern technology and markets, we're able to transmit, preserve, disseminate classics from the past like never before. We have greater access to Shakespeare and Beethoven than anyone alive at that time. Books, CDs, DVDs, and it's all also available on the internet, instant download, anywhere you are. Much of art is also a continuation, kind of a tribute to the past. We could even look at rap as an extension of this. It's like an extension of Shakespeare and Verdi. They're violent. They have some extremely violent, confrontational work. Cultural pessimist William Hazlitt considered poetry to thrive on contrast, effect, and excess. And to me, rap fits all those qualities as being valid poetry. Really quick, I want to read you this quote by Baldassare Castiglione. I have many times asked myself, not without wonder, the sources of a certain error which, since it is committed by all the old without exception, can be believed to be proper and natural to man. Namely, that they nearly all praise the past and blame the present, revile our actions and behavior and everything which they themselves did not do when they were young, and affirm, too, that every good custom and way of life, every virtue, and in short, all things imaginable, are always going from bad to worse. This guy wrote this in the 1500s. I mean, 500 years ago, this guy knew that cultural pessimism was a bunch of bunk. Why can't people get it now? No. Decline of moral values, another thing. Rated R movies do well critically, but they do not do well in the box office. What people vote for with their dollars are family films, and there's a gigantic Christian film market, straight to DVD. Top 10 grossing